Chapter 5. The Coming Great Migrations. The art of prophecy is very difficult, especially with respect to the future. Mark Twain. The Old and New Testaments have many parables of how the firstborn, or first chosen, lose their places in their father's houses. A hungry Esau sells his birthright to his brother Jacob for a mess of potage. In Matthew 22, Jesus compares heaven to the wedding feast a king prepares for his son. When the invited guests rudely refuse the king's invitation, he sends his servants out to the highways and byways to bring strangers into his house to celebrate the marriage of his son. As Western peoples have begun to die, the vacant rooms in the House of the West will not long remain vacant. In America, the places prepared for the 40 million unborn lost since Roe v. Wade have been filled by the grateful poor of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. As Europeans forgo children, the places prepared for them, too, will be occupied by strangers. Let us revisit the UN statistics on the depopulation of Europe. In 2000, there were 494 million Europeans aged 15 to 65. That will plunge to 365 million by 2050. But the 107 million Europeans over 65 today will soar to 172 million. In 50 years, the ratio of European young and middle-aged to seniors and elderly will fall from 5-1 to 2-1. With Europe's welfare states already buckling under the weight of social programs, who will pay for the health, welfare, and pensions of the elderly? Who will care for the old people in the retirement centers and nursing homes? With the number of children falling even faster than those of working age, who will mow the lawns, clean the buildings, wash the dishes, prepare and serve food in the restaurants of Europe? Where will the nannies come from? With a working population 25% smaller and an elderly population 90% larger, where will the new nurses and doctors come from to care for these seniors? By 2050, a third of Europe's people will be over 60. In the UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, 1 in 10 will be over 80. The median age of a European will be 50, 9 years above the median age of the oldest nation on Earth today, Japan. In Grey Dawn, How the Coming Age Wave Will Transform America and the World, former Commerce Secretary Pete Peterson writes, "Within the next 30 years, the official projection suggests that governments in most developed countries will have to spend at least an extra 9 to 16% of GDP annually, simply to meet their old age benefit promises. To pay these costs through increased taxation would raise the total tax burden by an unthinkable extra 25 to 40% of every worker's taxable wages, in countries where total payroll tax rates often already exceed 40%. Or, if we resort to deficit spending, we would have to consume all of the savings and more of the entire developed world. This is the fiscal equivalent of nuclear winter. If Europe wishes to maintain its social safety net, there are 3 options. Trillions of dollars in new tax revenues must be found. European women must begin bearing 2 and 3 times as many babies, or Europe must import millions of workers each year. These are the stark choices the old continent faces. Yet, as Joseph Kami of the UN Population Agency notes, no demographers believe birth rates will rebound. How much will it take to convince a woman to have 4 children? People are concerned about their appearances, their education, their careers. Europe's birth rate has been falling for decades. It is no fluke. A birth rate below replacement levels is common to every nation in Europe but Albania, which is Muslim. This is not a matter of conspiracy, but a consensus of free choice. European women have decided they want 1 or 2 children, or none, and they have the means, contraception, sterilization, and abortion, to effect these choices. And European women consider these personal desires to be far more compelling than demographic studies describing what Europe will look like when they are 70 or 80 or gone. A huge decision confronts Europe, writes Jonathan Steele of The Guardian. If living standards are not to fall, EU countries may have to allow a 60-fold increase in immigration, feeding right-wing protests and causing additional damage to the region's fragile race relations. This is the considered view of demographic experts as they examine the reality of Europe's aging population. Mass immigration has already begun. In 2000, England took in 185,000 immigrants, a record. In 1999, 500,000 illegal aliens slipped into the European Union, a 10-fold increase from 1993. In May 2001, The Washington Post reported, "Just a year ago, discoveries of foundering ships jammed with human cargo of 500 to 1,000 people would have been a novelty that generated headlines and outrage across Europe. But now they have become routine in the waters between Turkey and destinations in Greece, Italy, and as far north as the French Riviera." The Camp of the Saints, Jean Raspail's 1972 novel about an invasion of France by an armada of destitute Third World people, whom Europe, paralyzed by its egalitarianism and liberalism, is powerless to resist, appears to have been prophetic. History has begun to imitate art. Europe appears unable to stop these millions from coming and taking the jobs opening up as the war generation passes away. Indeed, employers will demand they be brought in. So will the growing millions of seniors and elderly. And as the millions pour into Europe from North Africa and the Middle East, they will bring their Arab and Islamic culture, traditions, loyalties, and faith, and create replicas of their homelands in the heartland of the West. Will they assimilate? Or will they endure as indigestible parts of Africa and Arabia in the base camp of what was once Christendom? Consider the numbers. As populations of Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, and Greece all shrink, on the other side of the inland sea, in Morocco, Algeria, Tanzania, Libya, and Egypt, populations will explode by 73 million in 25 years. In 1982, when the author was in Cairo, there were 44 million Egyptians. By 1998, it was 64 million. By 2025, Egypt's population is projected to hit 96 million. In the 19th century, Europe invaded and colonized Africa. In the 21st century, Africa invades and colonizes Europe, writes Nicholas Eberstadt, the AEI population expert. In 1995, the estimated populations of Europe, including Russia, and Africa were almost exactly equal. In 2050, by these projections, Africans would outnumber Europeans more than 3 to 1. Only the AIDS epidemic stands in the way of a Europe overshadowed and eventually overwhelmed by African peoples. Unlike America, Europe's nations are homogeneous. They have no history of welcoming strangers or assimilating immigrants. These peoples of different colors, creeds, and cultures will also be arriving in Europe as its nation-states are crumbling. Since 1990, 3 European nations, the USSR, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, have subdivided into 21 nations. 2 more, Kosovo and Montenegro, may soon be born. Secessionist movements are alive in Russia, Macedonia, Italy, Corsica, the Basque Country of Spain, Scotland, Wales, Bavaria, and the Skane region of Sweden. In Belgium, the ancient language and culture conflict between Flemish and Walloons is flaming up. In Europe, with its 40,000-year-old indigenous white population, the rise of a non-white majority may not be greeted with equanimity, dryly noted London's Guardian in October 2000. Then spring race riots in Oldham and Leeds, Bradford and Burnley, between South Asians and whites, underscores the Guardian's point. Anti-immigration parties have sprung up. The National Front of France's Jean-Marie Le Pen, the Freedom Party of Austria's Jörg Haider, the Swiss People's Party of Christoph Blocher. As waves of immigration from the Islamic nations of North Africa and the Middle East, and black nations of the Sub-Sahara rise, crest, and crash into Europe, the immigration issue will become even more explosive. Major parties will seize the issue from the minor parties. Our minor parties will become the major ones. The German Christian Democratic Party leaders, Angela Merkel and Edmund Stoiber, already appears to be moving to capitalize on the backlash against Islamic immigration. The idea of a united Germany as a multicultural society of almost 80 million people, with more than 7 million foreign-born, appears to trouble Miss Merkel, writes the New York Times. No other nation in Europe has as many foreigners. Miss Merkel is irritated at U.S. demands that Turkey be brought into the EU, as membership would confer on Turks the right to move freely across Europe. About 75% of the Turks in the world who live outside Turkey are in Germany, Merkel told the Times' Roger Cohen. We don't say they should not be Muslim, but we do say that we are a country with a Christian background, and Turks must understand this. Inviting Turkey to become a candidate for the European Union membership was a mistake. There are differences of values. We do not have the same understanding of human rights. Try opening a Christian church in Istanbul. Europe's nations are small. densely populated, and have no experience as melting pots. Thus, their ruling elites seem more alert, apprehensive, and tough-minded about the social perils of mass immigration than Americans. But those same nations and their ruling elites are late, very late, in awakening to the demographic danger presented by a dying population. Katastroika. No nation will be more adversely affected by its collapsing birth rate than Russia. Her population is projected to fall from 147 million to 114 million by 2050. As Russians are dying, China, even under its one-couple, one-child policy, expects 250 million more people by 2025. They will not be staying home. Chinese men already outnumber the women available to marry by 40 million. If Mother Russia is nervous, she should be. For even after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia has twice as much land as China. 3/4 of the enormous Russian landmass lies east of the Urals, but only 8 million Russians live in the trackless expanses of the Russian Far East, fewer people than there are in the Czech Republic. To their south, however, live 1.25 billion Chinese, with 250 million more on the way. This relative handful of Russians occupies the northern half of the largest continent on Earth, a landmass larger than the United States, filled with the world's most vital and desirable resources: timber, oil, gold. Russia has been hemorrhaging humanity at a rate unprecedented for a modern, industrialized nation, except during times of famine and war, writes British journalist John O'Mahony. In the winter of 2001, he traveled to the Far East in Kamchatka Peninsula and returned with a grim tale of despair and death. Since the fall of communism, Kamchatka's capital has already lost 1/4 of its population. In nearby regions, the virtual death of civilized society is imminent. However, it is at the exposed and vulnerable extremities of the vast Russian territories that the atrophy of the population has been most acute. Perhaps the most startling example is Chukotka, a massive chunk of the Far East, 3 times the size of Britain, where the population has withered by a staggering 60%, from 180,000 in 1990 to just 65,000 today, a figure that is expected to slump to just 20,000 within the next 5 years, making the region's infrastructure unsustainable. China has long looked on slices of Siberia as lost territories, stolen in the 19th century when China was weak and beset by revolution and preyed upon by Western imperial powers. During the Taiping Revolt that took 25 million lives, the Tsar's agent swindled the Qing Empire out of 350,000 square miles north of the Amur and between the Ussuri and the sea. This land, now Siberia's maritime province, is twice the size of California and fits around Manchuria like a cupped hand. Vladivostok, Russia's port on the Sea of Japan, naval base of her Pacific Fleet, was founded in 1860 on land that had belonged to the Chinese until that year. And as Russia has had to surrender all the lands taken from Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Tadshiks, and Turkmen, what was taken from China will also be reclaimed. In Mr. Nixon's first months in office in 1969, Chinese and Russian troops clashed on the long Amur-Ussuri frontier. And while an entente currently exists between Beijing and Moscow, the Chinese have not forgotten. Before the middle of this century, Beijing will likely try to regain those lands, and Alaska's neighbors across the Bering Strait could be tough young Chinese pioneers, rather than elderly Russians. Already, Chinese settlers are moving into Russian territory, just as Americans once moved into Mexico's northern province of Texas before tearing it away. Russians in the Far East worry about China to the point of paranoia, reports the Financial Times. An opinion poll conducted last year, 2000, in Primoriv, the province around Vladivostok, to the south of Khabarovsk, found 74% of the population expected China to annex all or part of their region in the long run. Russia's other threat comes from the ex-Soviet republics to its south: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. Let us add Afghanistan, where Islamic rebels delivered the coup de grâce to the Soviet Empire. Moscow seeks to reassert its authority in this region it calls its near abroad. But Russians are historically European and Orthodox Christian, while these people are Asian and Islamic and bitterly resentful at having been colonized and communized. It seems less likely that Russia will be driving south to recapture these lands than that Islamic migrants will be coming north with, perhaps, Islamic warriors to tear off chunks of Russia, such as Chechnya. Russia's ally in the Caucasus, Armenia, another Christian nation, has joined Russia, Latvia, Bulgaria, and Spain among the nations with the lowest fertility rates on Earth. Armenia, too, has begun to die. By 2025, Iran's population will be approaching that of Russia. Already, Iranians are menacing the former Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan. Moscow's retreat from Asia appears as inevitable as Chinese and Islamic encroachment on territories once dominated by czars and commissars. Gazing at these population projections, Russia's Academy of Science has coined a new term, katastroika. The scientists understand demography is destiny. As Russia's population shrinks, consider what will be happening elsewhere in Central Asia. Central Asian states, populations in 2000 and projections in 2025, numbers represented in millions of people. Afghanistan, 22.7 in 2000, projected 44.9 in 2025. Kazakhstan, 16.2 in 2000, projected 17.7 in 2025. Uzbekistan, 24.3 in 2000, projected 33.4 in 2025. Kyrgyzstan, 4.7 in 2000, projected 6.1 in 2025. Tajikistan, 6.2 in 2000, projected 8.9 in 2025. Turkmenistan, 4.5 in 2000, projected 6.3 in 2025. Total, 78.6 in 2000, projected 117.3 in 2025. With half of Russia's population today, these 6 nations in 25 years will have almost as many people, and the Russians will be older and grayer, and these Islamic peoples younger and more virile. In the 19th century, immense, mighty, and populous Russia pressed down upon what the Tsars called the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. By present projections, the populations of Turkey and Russia will be comparable in 2050. By 2100, there will be only 80 million Russians. Who will be the sick man of Europe then? Who the predator, and who the prey? Long before then, says Anatoly Antonov, head of the Department of Family Sociology at Moscow State University, a crisis will come. This is the dilemma of all Western civilizations. Why do we feel happy without having children? Antonov wants the government to use the media to boost the image of the family. If Russian men and women do not act soon to increase the population, Antonov fears that extremists could seize power in the name of the survival of the Russian people. If the population decline isn't reversed, warns Antonov, we will get a fascist state. If Russia could put its Cold War defeat and resentment at the loss of superpower status behind it, Moscow would see that America is a natural ally in preserving her unity, integrity, and independence. And Americans should recognize that in any clash of civilizations, Russians will man the eastern and southeastern fronts of the heartland of the West. As for Ukraine, the second most populous former Soviet republic, the UN projects a population loss of 40%, reducing Ukrainians from 50 million today to fewer than 30 million in 2050. And this is optimistic, based on a significant rise in Ukraine's fertility rate from 1.26 children per woman today to 1.70. For whom the bell tolls. From the 16th to the 20th century, the great Western nations colonized most of the world. Beginning in 1754, Americans crossed the Alleghenies and drove the French and then the Spanish off their continent, swallowed half of Mexico, corralled the surviving Indians on reservations, pushed over the Rockies to the Pacific, and vaulted to Hawaii, Midway, Guam, and the Philippines. On the other side of the world, Russians under the Romanovs were seizing all of the lands from the Arctic to Afghanistan, from Prussia to the Pacific, and down the panhandle of Alaska to Sitka. Led by the British, European nations were invading and colonizing Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and establishing enclaves on the coast of a helpless China. The reels of history are now running in reverse. The Great Retreat of the West, begun with the collapse of Europe's empires after World War II, reaches climax this century as the second great Islamic wave rolls into Europe and the peoples of Central Asia and China reclaim what the Tsars took from them in centuries past. By 2050, Russia will have lost slices of Siberia and will have been pushed out of the Caucasus and back over the Urals into Europe. If a clod be washed away by the sea, wrote the poet Dawn, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Therefore, never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Iran and the Gulf. In the run-up to Desert Storm, the author argued against the Gulf War thus: an American victory would leave us with imperial duties Americans would not indefinitely sustain. The Emirate of Kuwait was not a viable nation. It could not survive without a powerful protector. But Americans would eventually tire and go home, just as the British went home, and Kuwait would be absorbed by Iraq or Iran. All we could do was hold Kuwait temporarily. Moreover, the great adversary in the Gulf, with 3 times Iraq's population and territory, was Iran. We lost the debate, and the United States won the war, but the argument seems even more compelling today. With America having adopted a policy of dual containment of Iran and Iraq, consider the population projections over the next 25 years alone. Persian Gulf in millions of people. Years 2000 and 2025. Iraq, 23.1 in 2000. Projected, 41.0 in 2025. Iran, 67.7 in 2000. Projected, 94.5 in 2025. In 1990, the United States boasted of the 600-ship Navy of Ronald Reagan. Since the Gulf War, the U.S. Navy has been cut in half. The Army has been cut in half. The Air Force has been cut in half. By 2010, the United States anticipates a 200-ship Navy. The great coalition assembled by the first President Bush to defeat and contain Iraq has collapsed. Arab nations have defected, as have Europeans, save for the British, whose armed forces have also been cut in half since the end of the Cold War. General Schwarzkopf's army could have marched into Baghdad, hanged Saddam, and imposed a MacArthur regency. But with existing U.S. and Allied force levels, and the reluctance of Europeans and Arabs to march again with us, it is not likely there will ever be a Desert Storm 2. By 2025, Iran will have 94.5 million people, a population far greater than that of any European nation but Russia. The technology of the atomic bomb will be 80 years old, and Iran, which already has ballistic missiles, will almost surely have acquired the bomb. And since the atomic age began, no nation with atomic weapons has ever had its homeland invaded or a majority war launched upon it. The only nuclear nation ever attacked was Israel, by pinprick scud strikes from an Iraq that was being demolished. As the North Koreans have shown the world, even a rogue nation can get a respectful hearing from the United States if it can build an atom bomb. Europe, dead man walking. When Bethmann Hollweg returned from Vienna to brief the Kaiser on the condition of their Austro-Hungarian ally on the eve of war, the shaken foreign minister stammered, "Sire, we are allied to a corpse." So are we. Once great warrior nations that put millions of soldiers onto the battlefields of Europe in the 20th century, today field armies that are little more than national police forces. The Balkan Wars of the 90s exposed their impotence without the United States. In Bosnia, Britain and France had to call for the Americans lest their troops be taken hostage by local Serbs. Alliances are entered into to strengthen nations. How is America strengthened by a treaty to defend forever a continent that refuses to raise the armies to defend itself, and whose populations have begun to die? Turkey and Britain accepted, the NATO nations are more dependencies than allies. AWOL in Vietnam, they were only marginally helpful in the Gulf. Outside Europe, their troops are used mainly for UN police duties in sub-Saharan Africa. No longer do they seem to be able to call up the loyalties and sacrifices of olden times. Today, the 15-nation European Union needs several years to muster 60,000 soldiers for its vaunted rapid reaction force. European threats to go it alone are the threats of children to run away from home. who never quite succeed because their mothers told them not to cross the street. Something vital has gone out of Europe. Once, Western nations were willing to sacrifice for the ashes of their fathers and the temples of their gods. But Europeans today, though far richer and more numerous than in 1914 or 1939, are not. The day of Europe is over. The coming mass migrations from the Islamic world will so change the ethnic composition of the old continent that Europeans will be too paralyzed by a threat of terrorism to intervene in North Africa, the Middle East, or the Persian Gulf. Europeans already ignore sanctions on Iran, Iraq, and Libya. As their populations become more Arabic and Islamic, paralysis will set in. We should know. From the 1850s until World War I, U.S. policy toward the British Empire was held hostage by the Irish, whose votes were decisive in states like New York. With populations declining and children vanishing, Europe has no vital interest to justify sending tens of thousands of their young to war if they are not attacked. At present birth rates, Europe's population in 2100 will be less than a third what it is today. Europe has voted for la dolce vita. But if Europeans are so uninterested in self-preservation that they refuse to have enough children to keep their nations alive, why should Americans defend Europe? And perhaps die for Europe, so they can live the high life until flame out? Europe has embraced her destiny. Perhaps not consciously as a people, but collectively as a people. Europeans do not plan to continue as a great, vital race. What then are we defending? Christianity? That is dead in Europe. Western civilization? But by their decisions not to have children, Europeans have already accepted a 22nd century end to their civilization. A final solution to the aging question. In 1973, Humanist Manifesto 2, thousands of U.S. intellectuals urged recognition of an individual's right to die with dignity, euthanasia, and the right to suicide. They were ahead of their time. On November 28, 2000, the lower house of the Dutch parliament voted 104 to 40 to legalize assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia. The first nation since Hitler's Germany, wrote Nat Hendhoff in Jewish World Review, to legalize the direct killing of patients by physicians. The parliament was rushing to catch up with Dutch doctors, who have been doing euthanasia for decades. In 1991, a government-backed study found that the majority of all euthanasia deaths in the Netherlands are involuntary. Under the new law, children ages 12 to 15 will need a parent's consent to commit suicide or have a doctor help them kill themselves. But after 16, parental consent will no longer be needed. The Council of Europe accused the Dutch of violating the European Convention of Human Rights, but Dutch doctors are already far down the slippery slope toward the Third Reich. As Rita Marker of the International Anti-Euthanasia Task Force reports, a month before the lower house debated the new euthanasia law, a Dutch court ruled that Dr. Philip Sartorius was medically justified when he helped 86-year-old Edward Brongersa commit suicide. Brongersa was not physically ill or in pain. He said that he was simply tired of life and his aging, hopeless existence. From his jail cell, Jack Kevorkian saluted the Dutch and predicted America would not be far behind. The U.S. Hemlock Society was equally enthusiastic and hopeful that Holland would show us the way. Said Hemlock President Faye Grish, "We are very excited. We have admired what the people of Holland have been doing for the last 20 years. To the Dutch Voluntary Euthanasia Society, however, the new law is gravely deficient, for it does not grant euthanasia rights for those simply weary of life. We think that if you are old, you have no family near, and you are really suffering from life, then it should be possible," said a DVES spokesman. Minister of Health Els Borst agreed. "Very old people who are sick of life," she said, "should be allowed to kill themselves. I'm not against it, as long as it can be carefully enough regulated so that it only concerns very old people who are tired of living. If such a patient wants to die," said the minister, "he or she should be given a suicide pill." In his Christmas message in 2000, John Paul II surely had Holland in mind when he spoke of alarming signs of the culture of death. We cannot but recall today that shadows of death threaten people's lives at every stage of life, and are especially menacing at its earliest beginning and its natural end. The temptation is becoming even stronger to take possession of death by anticipating its arrival. as though we were masters of our own lives or the lives of others. Hentoff is on the side of the Holy Father. During the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, the country's physicians rebelled against the culture of death by refusing to cooperate in the killing of patients. But now, their changed attitude reminds me of the October 17, 1933 New York Times report from Berlin that the German Ministry of Justice intended to authorize physicians to end the suffering of incurable patients upon request in the interests of true humanity. Yet, a hard look at the demographic and moral trends in Europe does not inspire confidence that this is a winning fight for those whom the Holy Father speaks. For a Christianity that teaches that God is the author of life and that no one has a right to take innocent life is not a growth stock in Europe. By 2050, over 10% of the population of the 4 largest nations in Western Europe, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, will be over 80 years old. Will Europe's workers, whose taxes must rise and whose retirements must be put off to subsidize the pensions and healthcare costs of this burgeoning aged population, insist that the sick and senile elderly in their 80s and 90s be kept alive? A university study in Belgium found that 1 in 10 deaths there is doctor-induced, either by lethal injection without the patient's permission or by withholding treatment. In Zurich, assisted suicide is permissible in homes for the elderly. The baby boomers of Europe may live to see their lives ended, without their consent, by a society that has turned as callous toward their wish to stay alive as they were to the unborn in their own time. What goes around comes around. After the Newark riot of 1967, its black mayor wittily observed, "I don't know where America is going, but Newark is going to get there first. Where Europe is at today, America will almost surely arrive tomorrow." In 1984, Colorado Governor Dick Lamb startled seniors when he told a group of doctors, "We've got a duty to die and get out of the way with all of our machines and artificial hearts, and let the other society, our kids, build a reasonable life." Princeton now has on faculty an Australian bioethicist, Peter Singer, who argues that if a child is born with disabilities so severe that its parents and doctors think it would be better off dead, it is ethical to kill the newborn and let the couple conceive a healthy child. Singer's argument is not illogical. If we concede parents' rights to abort an unborn infant up to 9 months, why do they lose the right to end its life the moment the fetus slips out of the womb? Singer's ideas have an impressive pedigree. As far back as 1919, Margaret Sanger was admonishing America in her magazine Birth Control Review. More children from the fit, less from the unfit. Americans and Germans were soon competing to advance Sanger's ideas. In 1920, Dr. Alfred Hoch, professor of psychiatry at the University of Freiburg, and Karl Binding, a law professor at Leipzig University, published The Permission to Destroy Life Unworthy of Life. The book argued the case for assisted suicide for the terminally ill and euthanasia for those empty shells of human beings, the mentally retarded, and those with brain damage and psychiatric conditions. A poll found 3 in 4 German parents favored letting physicians end the lives of severely retarded children. In October 1933, the New York Times quoted Hitler's Ministry of Justice as saying that ridding society of these poor creatures would make it possible for physicians to end the tortures of incurable patients upon requests in the interests of true humanity. The money saved could be used to benefit those on the threshold of old age. The language of tenderness is familiar to us all. It calls to mind the words Walker Percy put into the mouth of Father Smith in The Thanatos Syndrome. Do you know where tenderness leads? Tenderness leads to the gas chamber. In making their case, the Nazis could cite Churchill, who wanted the curse of madness to die, and George Bernard Shaw, who had said in 1933, "If we desire a certain type of civilization, we must exterminate the sort of people who do not fit in." The Fuhrer's thoughts exactly, GB. Among the first and most famous cases of mercy killing was Baby Nauer. The little boy's father made a direct plea to Hitler to allow his son, blind, retarded, and missing an arm and leg, to die. Hitler referred the request to his physician Karl Brandt. In 1938, permission was granted. Mercy deaths became common in Germany. In a review of Mein Kampf, which introduced the 1939 Book of the Month Club selection, journalist Dorothy Thompson excoriated Hitler, except on one issue. On the subject of eugenics, Hitler writes rationally, up to a point. Eugenists all over the world will agree with him that the palpably unfit for reproduction should be sterilized. But the German sterilization laws include habitual drunkards, and it is an amusing thought that had they existed pre-Hitler Austria, Hitler himself would never have been born. Neither, incidentally, would Beethoven or Nietzsche. There is scientific foundation, though the field needs more exploration, for some of Hitler's eugenics ideas. Poet W.B. Yeats echoed Miss Thompson. Since improvements in agriculture and industry are threatening to remove the last check on the multiplication of the ineducable masses, the better stocks have not been replacing their numbers, while the stupider and less healthy have been. When war came, Hitler's eugenic ideas received more exploration. He ordered the mercy killing of life unworthy of life, useless eaters, deformed infants, and the severely retarded. Codenamed Action 4, the program did away with scores of thousands before Bishop Clemens von Galen, in a fiery sermon in Münster Cathedral in 1940, excoriated Hitler's regime for plain murder and called on Catholics to withdraw ourselves and our faithful from their Nazi influence, so that we may not be contaminated by their thinking and their ungodly behavior. Jolted, Berlin publicly put the program on hold, but continued it quietly. One veteran of Action 4, Franz Stangl, would do his graduate work at a place called Treblinka. In Judgment of Nuremberg, the 1960 film, Montgomery Clift movingly portrayed a victim of the Nazi eugenics program, conditionally endorsed by Dorothy Thompson. But no film ever portrayed Raymond Ludlow, an American hero who came home from World War II with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a Prisoner of War Medal. A repeated runaway in his early teens, Raymond Ludlow had been forcibly sterilized under the laws of Virginia, one of 31 states to pass compulsory sterilization laws in the halcyon days of Margaret Sanger. The battle between those who believe in the sanctity of human life and those who believe some lives are not worth living and ought to be ended is thus not a new one. And with Europe facing a future where a third of her people will be over 65 and 1 in 10 over 80, and with few Bishop von Galens and John Paul II's around, the outcome does not appear to be in much doubt. Israel and the Middle East. Though Israel's population is growing, the neighborhood trend helps one to understand why warrior statesmen such as Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Barak concluded that they had no choice but to trade land for peace. The fertility rate among Palestinians in Israel is 4.5 children per woman. On the West Bank, 5.5 children per woman. In Gaza, 6.6 children per woman. If demography is destiny, Israel is in an existential crisis that can only be exacerbated by continued military occupation and expansion of settlements. Projected population growths in the Middle East from 2000 to 2025. Numbers represented in millions of people. Israel, 6.2 in 2000, 8.3 in 2025. Jordan, 6.7 in 2000, 12.1 in 2025. Egypt, 68.5 in 2000, 95.6 in 2025. Syria, 16.1 in 2000, 26.3 in 2025. Lebanon, 3.3 in 2000, 4.4 in 2025. Saudi Arabia, 21.6 in 2000, 40.0 in 2025. In the next 25 years, Israel's population, Jewish and Arab, will grow by 2.1 million, while her Arab neighbors will swell by 62.2 million. Now, consider Israel's Palestinian problem. In 25 years, there will be 2 million Palestinians inside Israel, 7 million on the West Bank and in Gaza, and 7 million in Jordan. 16 million Palestinians living cheek by jowl with 6 million Jewish Israelis. 60% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian. In 2050, there will be 3 million Palestinians inside Israel, 12 million on the West Bank and in Gaza, and 10 million in Jordan. 25 million Palestinians living alongside 7 million Jewish Israelis at mid-century. But if Israel must view these numbers with alarm, so should the kings of Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Jordan is among the poorest nations in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is run by a royal house that has antagonized millions of its people by being seen as America's agent and having invited thousands of infidels onto sacred Islamic soil. Not one of the 22 Arab countries today qualifies as fully democratic. Yet, the more democratic they become, the more responsive their regimes must be to the will of the Arab street. Those who tell us that democracies never go to war with one another may see that proposition tested, as Arab monarchies fall to more democratic regimes, as happened in Tehran with the overthrow of the Shah. Return of the Prophet. At the beginning of the 7th century, the Mediterranean world was Christian. But within 50 years of Muhammad's hijrah to Medina in 622, the armies of Islam had swept over the southern coast of the inland sea. Early in the 8th century, Arabs and Berbers brushed aside weak Visigoth resistance over Spain and crossed the Pyrenees into France, where one of the decisive battles of history was fought. At Tours, the hammer of the Franks, Charles Martel, defeated the Muslims, who withdrew back over the mountains. Thus was Christendom saved in the tongue between the rivers, a little south of Châtelherault, and a day's march north of Poitiers, wrote Hilaire Belloc. Except for the tiny kingdom of Asturia, which would be the base camp of the Spanish Reconquista, Islam dominated the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. Not until 1492 did Ferdinand and Isabella finally drive the Moors out of Spain. In the east, the Islamic invasion came later. In the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire entered the Balkans and defeated the Serbs at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. In 1453, Constantinople fell. In 1683, the Turks were at the gates of Vienna when they were stopped by the Polish king John Sobieski, but not until 1913 were they finally driven out of most of the Balkans. The high tide of Western Empire came at the close of World War I. In November 1917, Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour declared it to be His Majesty's policy to create a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, as a British army under Allenby marched into Jerusalem. The Ottoman Empire went into receivership, and, under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British and French divided the spoils. 3 decades later, a Jewish state was born among the Arabs, under the auspices of the British Empire and a US-dominated UN. But, by 1948, the British Empire was in retreat, out of India, out of Palestine, out of Jordan, out of Egypt, out of Iraq, out of the Gulf, with the French Empire close behind. Now the signs are everywhere that Islam is rising again. An Islamic secessionist movement is active in the Philippines. Muslim troops battle Christian secessionists in Indonesia. From Palestine to Pakistan, street mobs cheered the slaughter at the Pentagon and World Trade Center. For years, the Taliban gave sanctuary to Osama bin Laden and his terrorist cells, and dispatched holy warriors into the old Soviet republics of Central Asia and to assist Chechen rebels fighting in Russia. Before the US-led alliance drove him from power, Taliban ruler Mullah Muhammad Omar ordered all religious statues smashed, including the 7th century great Buddhas of Bamiyan, declaring, "These idols have been gods of the infidels." Israel was driven out of Lebanon by Hezbollah and is being pushed off the West Bank and out of Gaza by intifadas, in which the suicide bombers of Hamas are assuming the lead role. In Turkey and Algeria, elections in the 1990s brought to power Islamic regimes, which were removed by methods other than democratic. In Egypt, Muslim militants have renewed the persecution of Christian Copts. Islamic law has now been imposed in 10 northern states of Nigeria. In Europe, Christian congregations are dying. Churches are emptying out. Mosques are filling up. There are 5 million Muslims in France, and between 12 and 15 million in the European Union. There are 1,500 mosques in Germany. Islam has replaced Judaism as the second religion of Europe. As the Christian tide goes out in Europe, an Islamic tide comes in. In 2000, for the first time, there were more Muslims in the world than Catholics. While the ideology of Islamism has failed in Afghanistan, Iran, and Sudan to create a modern state that can command the loyalty of its people and serve as a model for other Islamic nations, the religion of Islam has not failed. In science, technology, economics, industry, agriculture, armaments, and democratic rule, America, Europe, and Japan are generations ahead. But the Islamic world retains something the West has lost: a desire to have children and the will to carry on their civilization, cultures, families, and faith. Today, it is as difficult to find a Western nation where the native population is not dying as it is to find an Islamic nation where the native population is not exploding. The West may have learned what Islam knows not, but Islam remembers what the West has forgot. There is no vision but by faith. Israel as metaphor. As were the American Canal Zone, British Rhodesia, and the Republic of South Africa yesterday, Israel may today be seen as a metaphor and microcosm of the West itself. In its 1948 War of Independence, Israel expanded well beyond the borders set by the UN, exploiting blunders by Egypt's Nasser and the UN's U-Thant in 1967. Israel seized the Syrian Golan Heights, Arab East Jerusalem, the Old City, Gaza, and the West Bank, and occupied all of Sinai to the Suez Canal in 6 days. In 1982, Israel drove to the suburbs of Beirut and expelled the PLO. But the retreat of Eretz Israel had already begun. In 1973, the Egyptians recrossed the canal and took back western Sinai. 5 years later, the entire peninsula was restored to Egypt. In the 1980s and 1990s, Islamic militants conducted a guerrilla war that forced the Israelis out of Lebanon, and Palestinians launched an intifada that forced Israel to offer land for peace. By 2000, Prime Minister Barak offered 99% of the Golan Heights for peace with Syria, and 95% of the West Bank and Gaza, plus East Jerusalem, for peace with an independent Palestine. Assad and Arafat rejected the offers. Even if accepted by the Arabs, what guarantee has Israel that these are the last territorial demands on the Jewish state? Why should the Arabs, after having digested what Israel gives up, not pursue the goal of expelling the Zionist entity from the Middle East? Israelis say they are offering their neighbors a just peace, but Arabs may see Israel as a nation in retreat, trying to cut the best deal it can. Why should the Arabs not believe that as war brought Israel to the table to offer land for peace, more war will produce more land for peace? From the Arab standpoint, war works. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 led to Israel's surrender of Sinai. Hezbollah's jihad drove Israel out of Lebanon. 2 intifadas had forced Israel to offer to yield almost all of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. As for Israel's military might, it has no more halted her retreat than military superiority halted the retreat of the West. Did Russia's 20,000 nuclear weapons prevent the loss of Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the rest of Moscow's empire in the Caucasus and Central Asia? Here is the analogy with the West. Is it in the nature of things that nations and civilizations rise, expand, dominate, and rule, only to recede and offer equality to their subject peoples, and offer accepted until those subject peoples acquire the power to rise, expand, and dominate themselves? Is our era of the equality of nations really the end of history, or but a temporary truce, a phony peace, an armistice, a time of transition from a day of Western dominance to a day when the West pays tribute? British historian J.E. Frond once wrote that, if 10 men believe in something so deeply they are willing to die for it, and 20 men believe in something so deeply they are willing to vote for it, the 10 will give the law to the 20. As we look at America, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, which peoples today show a greater disposition to die for their dreams? Is all our prattle about the equality of peoples willful self-delusion? Is it but the prelude to a renewed struggle to control the destiny of men and nations, a struggle that a rich, depopulating, dying West, with its deep aversion to war, bred of the bloodbaths of the 20th century, is destined to lose? As Sophocles said, one must wait until evening to see how splendid the day has been. Is it the evening of the West? Militancy, martyrdoms, and, yes, intolerance are the marks of rising religions and conquering causes. Early Christians, who had accepted death rather than burn incense to Roman gods, were soon smashing those Roman gods. No equality for them. Baptizing Clovis, the Bishop of Reims admonished the King of the Franks, "Bend your neck, burn what you worship what you burn." Not very ecumenical, Your Grace. Protestant monarchs and Catholic kings alike did not flinch at burning heretics or drawing and quartering them at the Tyburn tree. The Christianity that conquered the world was not a milquetoast faith. And the custodians of that faith did not believe all religions were equal. One was true, all the rest were false. From the pulpits of Christian churches today, we hear mournful apologies for past sins. We were wrong to accompany the old conquistadors, wrong to impose our faith on native peoples, wrong to be the handmaidens of empire. We confess, we beg forgiveness from those against whom we and our fathers have sinned. Now, this can be the way to heaven, but it can lead to hell on earth. History teaches it is the whimpering dog that gets kicked. Who will convert to a religion whose priests or preachers go about in sackcloth and ashes, doing expiation for the sins of centuries past? Will the people now taught that they were victims of Christian racism be satisfied with apologies? Will they let bygones be bygones? Or will they say, these Christians, whose ancestors oppressed and robbed us, are now paralyzed with guilt and powerless to resist. Let us take back what they took from us. Then let us take what they have. Does the remorse of mainstream Christian denominations mean they have ascended to a higher moral plane? Or is this but a manifestation of their loss of faith in the truth and superiority of Christianity? If the West expects a long life, it had best recapture the fighting faith of its youth, for it is in the nature of things that nations and religions rule or are ruled. Times of equality are temporary truces in an endless struggle. Homo homini lupus, said the Roman playwright Plautus. Man is a wolf to man. Added Thomas Hobbles, I put forth for a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power, that ceaseth only in death. As Israel is an affluent modern nation surrounded by poor neighbors with historic grievances, so the West is a prosperous modern civilization surrounded by poor neighbors with historic grievances. And as Western intellectuals are harshest about Western history, so Israel's post-Zionist new historians paint their nation's birth in its blackest hues. And as the West believes all nations will be content with what they have, some Israelis believe the Palestinians will be content in their bantustans in Gaza and on the West Bank. But why should they? When Chinese outnumber Russians 20-1 instead of 10-1, why should they not seek to reclaim what was taken from them when Russia was strong and China was weak? Israel confronts an Islam with an ancient history of a fighting faith and peoples willing to die for a cause, while America shares 2,000 miles of border with Mexico. So perhaps the analogy is inexact. But then, America is not the country she once was. In 1953, an unsentimental old soldier named Ike ordered all illegal aliens out of the United States in Operation Wetback. Can anyone imagine Mr. Bush ordering 5 or 10 million illegal aliens expelled from the United States? As Golda Meir once said, Israel never had a better friend than Richard Nixon, who rescued her nation in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. But the Richard Nixon the author recalls was not blind to the forces of history. He used to say, a statesman must take the long view. In San Clement once, after he hung up from a courtesy call from Yitzhak Rabin, a friend we had met in Israel days after the Six-Day War, my wife, Shelley, asked the ex-president what the prospects for Israel were. The long run? Nixon responded. He extended his right fist, thumb up, in the manner of a Roman emperor passing sentence on a gladiator, and slowly turned his thumb over and down. I never asked him what he thought about the prospects of the West.